Hi, this is Anna, and you're listening to Powerhouse Chicago community activist running for Congress, my friend Kina Collins, on Two Broads Talking Politics.
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. Today we are speaking with Kina Collins, who is running for Congress in the Illinois 7th District. Hi, Kina.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And we're joined, of course, by my co-host, Sophie. Hey, Sophie.
Hey, hey.
So, Kina, could you start us off by just giving us a little bit of background about you and why you want to run for Congress now?
A lot of my background work is in gun violence prevention and criminal justice reform work. And recently, in the last year of my life, I took on a position with a national nonprofit called Physicians for a National Health Program, where I traveled across the country speaking with everyday Americans and organizing physicians and medical students from across the country to secure a single-payer Medicare for all system. And hearing those stories from people from San Diego and New York and Alabama and Missouri, it basically let me know that the economic reality of working class people was the same everywhere that I went. And we were all kind of dealing with the same issues. Why I'm running particularly in the Illinois 7th Congressional District is because it's a district that I was born and I was raised in the Austin community. And the one thing about the 7th Congressional District is it's one of the most economically and racially diverse districts in Illinois and has some of the greatest neighborhood disparities in the country, spanning from downtown Chicago through neighborhoods like Austin or Inglewood and Garfield Park, across to the western suburbs of Oak Park and River Forest. Every type of household demographic is represented in the 7th. And I think that the lack of investment and some of the most marginalized areas in the district has only served to widen those gaps. And I'm here to help put forth and push forth a progressive voice in this next primary.
Yeah, so people don't think of Illinois as being one of the gerrymandered states, but this is an oddly shaped district, to be sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's one portion of the district where it's literally just one street attaching another huge chunk of the district. It's extremely gerrymandered.
Yes, so I don't live terribly far from the 7th, but I think I'd have to walk through like 3 different districts to get there.
Yeah. It's once again, the diversity of it is the beauty of Illinois 7th. But I think that when we drill down a bit deeper to some of the disparities that the folks in the Illinois 7th are dealing with, that's when we know we have to be taking this bold action to rectify and come up with solution-oriented ways to solve those problems, right? But you're 100% correct. It's extremely gerrymandered.
So this is a very Democratic district. It's D plus 38 or something like that. Yes. And the incumbent, of course, is a Democrat who's been there for over 20 years. So essentially, you'll be running in a primary, and very likely the primary will be the deciding factor. So your race is a little bit earlier. The race you really need to be considering is a little bit earlier than is the case for some people. But why take on a primary challenge in particular?
Yeah, so you're 100% correct. Illinois 7 is tied for the 5th most Democratic district in the country. And you're right on the money with a D plus 38 ranking. And we are a true blue district. And for me, I think a district with such a strong political leaning towards the Democratic values and Democratic voters should expect to have one of the boldest progressive leaders out there. And I'm willing to take on some of the most pressing issues we're facing right now in this country. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the district is that we aren't leading on climate change. We aren't leading on gun violence reduction. We aren't leading on fighting for a single-payer Medicare for all system. And, that's mind-boggling to me, right? Because we have the constituency in the base that would back these bold progressive ideas. And we, in Illinois 7 could essentially be a model, a national model for other Democratic districts to be bold and push forth some of these progressive ideas. So that was one of the main reasons why I thought we should really take this historical opportunity that we're in right now to push some of those ideas forward.
Last year, you were instrumental, I believe, in the establishment of the Illinois Council on Women and Girls. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and sort of what work that does and sort of the story behind that.
Yeah. So when Trump took office, his administration eliminated many Obama-era programs. And one of them was the White House Council on Women and Girls. And when I found that out, I was determined to make sure that we continued that initiative here in Illinois. So in 2018, I helped build a statewide coalition to pass historic civil rights legislation, which was House Bill 5544, the Illinois Council on Women and Girls Act. And the council prioritizes the needs of women, including women who identify as transgendered and women of color, when evaluating state policies and allocating those resources out. So I traveled the state and talked to women in focus groups in about 68 out of the 102 counties in Illinois to hear their concerns and incorporate their feedback into policy. And so I think just that was also kind of a nudge. When I was co-authoring the bill, people thought Bruce Rauner will never sign transgendered rights or the expansion of reproductive health care. You're asking for a lot. And I think that we show that the power of the collective, the power of the community, everyday people, we galvanized them and we spoke and we got overwhelming bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. And he ended up signing the bill into law. And it was by sheer force of the community and women from all across the state who believed in this mission. And this was before RHA or any of these, Reproductive Health Act or any of these statewide abortion bans were happening. We just kind of had the foresight and saw this stuff coming up the pike. And for me, it's no longer just we need to grab them by the polls. I think we need to grab them by the policy. And that's exactly what we did. And it was extremely successful.
So you just mentioned the Reproductive Health Act. Here in Illinois, women's issues and reproductive health issues are finally getting more attention. But of course, nationally, this is still a very big problem. We have more women legislators in Congress and the Senate than ever before, but it's still not a huge representation. So what are some of the women's issues, the gender issues that you would like to see the next Congress really take on at a federal level?
Yeah, so I get excited when people talk about women's issues. Like, what does that mean? Let's talk about education. Let's talk about the economy. Let's talk about healthcare. All those things are women's issues. And I think that right now we see the deadlock that's happening on the federal level where there's not a lot of policy or legislation being pushed for. And there's certainly in some districts like the one that I'm in, Illinois 7, we're not seeing people be activated and mobilized. So for me, the top issues that I would like to see is obviously I would love to see the Hyde Amendment repealed. That's number one. Number two, I think that goes along hand in hand with healthcare. Health is literally everything that we're dealing with. It's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, it's the work conditions that we're working in. But specifically, if we're talking gender-wise, we can't talk about these policies without also interjecting the disparities that we're seeing with race as well. We are seeing Black mothers die while giving childbirth 3 to 4 times that of their counterparts of any other demographic, right? So Black mortality, Black women's mortality, infant mortality is something that I think that we need to pay attention to, which once again streamline into healthcare. I'm a gun violence prevention advocate, right? So we know that 30,000 people a year are dying by way of gun violence. It is a public health emergency. Yet we once again see this gridlock of CDC funding for research around gun violence prevention, as well as just really getting to the root causes of what's causing that. So there are a plethora of things. And I think one thing that I learned when I was traveling around the state was that the number one issue that a lot of women are talking about is the pay-wage equity gap. That was the number one thing that we heard. I spoke to some folks who were part of the agriculture industry in Illinois, and they said, well, women who get pregnant that are farmers, it's hard for them to be out into the fields. They're not really getting the direct services they need. They're not getting the benefits that they need when they have to go on leave. So we know that the pay wage equity gap is not just an Illinois issue, but it's a national issue. And that's something that I also would like to tackle.
And how would you want to do that? What sorts of legislation would you support to tackle that wage gap?
So there are several pieces of federal legislation that are out, but I think that the number one thing is that there is actual restrictions from corporations and businesses from reporting what salaries people actually make, right? So if we are getting that, we're seeing in the workforce and in the workforce environment, women are coming up with all types of strategies to find out if they're making less than their male counterparts, by basically talking to each other about their salaries, but there's no codified or formal, basically platform that requires federally for corporations and for small businesses or any business to report how much their employees are making. And I think that when we make that information public, we will begin to see basically the disparities and force the hands of a lot of these companies and organizations to pay women equitable wages.
We interview a lot of first-time candidates and people who are running for Congress who haven't been involved in politics before. But you have a great breadth and depth of knowledge of a lot of legislation. You've helped author legislation. You've helped advocate for legislation. How do you think that sort of gives you a leg up in sort of understanding and thinking through the job, as opposed to candidates who are, coming into politics having not really had a background in that sort of thing?
Well, what I would argue is that I think that everyday people are the experts of their communities, right? We kind of hear a lot of the time people talk about seniority or keeping the majority of elected officials who have this seniority in whatever, if it's statewide, citywide, or nationally. And I just don't agree with that. I think that I do not measure, particularly if we're talking about Congress, I do not measure the totality of this job by the number of years or the number of votes. We have to measure it by the experiences, the lived experiences, and how we can make that applicable to policy. And for me, a lot of people, what I learned when I was getting the Illinois Council on Women and Girls Act passed was that the lens that I was looking out of was an intersectional lens. It was, me being young, me being working class, me being a woman of color. I see how we're oftentimes cut out of the resources of a lot of this policy. And so when I started to co-author my bill, I made it a point to not leave any woman behind or anybody behind in the legislation that I wrote, because I know the detrimental impact that it has. So I think having a policy background it helps you navigate through the spaces, but I also think that those who've never written policy before, if they're bringing their lived experiences to the policy table, that is what's going to help us elevate this country to the next level, because it just offers a different perspective that we traditionally have not seen in these spaces.
There's a lot of issues facing the country. You've mentioned a bunch of them, but how do you think Congress should prioritize things, especially the next Congress, and how does that differ if, let's say, Democrats do win the presidency and the Senate, or one or the other? How does Congress sort of figure out how to move? The House is doing a ton of things right now, and then they're all just going to the Senate to die. How do you see as a way to sort of get things done that are actually going to get passed?
Yeah, I think we have to start activating the electorates across the country, right? In these districts where people think that, for example, a single payer Medicare for all system it will never get passed. It's impossible. Well, I disagree with that. I've been to, like I said, San Diego, the Appalachians, places like Missouri, Pittsburgh, Alabama, right? Blood red states like Alabama. And I've seen firsthand, up close and personal, how healthcare is a purple issue. It's not red, it's not blue. It is something that fundamentally impacts our entire country. And so I think it's going to take mass mobilizing, not just by the elected officials in these districts, but collaborative work between policymakers and community groups that have been advocating for civil rights issues for decades, like Fight for 15, Medicare for All, reducing gun violence or eradicating gun violence in our generation, right? I think it's going to require the people to speak up alongside their elected officials. And people move the agenda forward, right? We saw when ACA was getting ready to be, or they tried to repeal the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, how disability rights groups and immigrant rights groups and unions and teachers and nurses and doctors, everybody stood up and they said, this isn't right. And we were able to keep it intact, right? So that wasn't saved by any, in my opinion, any just one elected official. It was saved by the everyday people in this country.
There's one issue we haven't talked about a lot, and I want to make sure we get to it because it's really important to me. I know that you, like me, were a product of public schools. Yeah. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about public education and what you think the federal government can be doing to help public education, because my problem is always that so much of public education policy ends up coming out of the local government or the state government. So what do you think that Congress can be doing to help improve public education in the country?
Absolutely. So I am a product of Chicago Public Schools. People always look at me so funny when I'm like all proud to say that because they had their experience with Chicago Public Schools, but I had a really great experience. I had teachers who were invested. I had teachers who didn't care what zip code or neighborhood I came from. They gave me a fair shot at climbing the ladder of success and feeling confident to pursue ambitious goals. And I think that I know that that model exists, that public schools that are invested in, public schools that are basically prioritized over the option of having charter schools, et cetera, can succeed, right? They can produce students who are, like I said, ambitious and can take on and tackle ambitious goals. So a few of the things in my district in particular that I would be interested in, and it's something that a lot of schools around the country can benefit from, is we need to start investing in wraparound services in a lot of schools. So I believe that we should be having nurses and social workers in a lot of these schools that are in marginalized communities. And that's just me coming from a GVP background as well, right? Gun violence prevention background. We know that some students who come to schools have issues at home, and it spills over and affects the work that they have in school. So by having those full-time social workers and nurses in the schools, we can prevent things like bullying from impacting schoolwork. We can prevent things like post-traumatic stress disorder from students who come from communities that experience intracommunal violence. We can, have services for students who are dealing with mental illnesses and may need help, right? So I think that taking a healthcare or a public health approach to public school is important. I also think that we need to change the formula of how we fund schools because it's inequitable. We know that some communities, and some may argue that that's a state issue as well because it varies state by state, but we also know that property tax is the way that a lot of these schools are funded. Well, when you come from a neighborhood like mine in Austin, the property value is way lower in Austin than it is in 10 minutes west in my district in Oak Park, right? So we have to change the funding formula. I think we have to give access to social services like nurses and social workers. And I think that we also need to have continuing education for some of the parents, right? Providing direct services for parents, specifically immigrant parents or parents who may be undocumented, giving them options to learn English or learn different tools or techniques that can help them succeed and help their student as well. And those are things that we just don't talk about either, right? So there are entire demographics who are being left behind in our public school systems. And I think, once again, the funding, not having access to direct services, and also not having a pipeline on how do we help parents help their children succeed is something that I would like to work on.
You've started to answer, I think, some of the ways that the federal government could be helping in gun violence prevention. Are there other bills that you would like to see go through to help prevent gun violence?
Yeah, so we had a model here in Illinois, which the Gun Dealers Licensing Act, which I think could be really beneficial on the federal level. And it puts the onus back on these gun shops, right, who sell the guns or gun show loopholes that are out there. It basically requires that each gun is licensed and that it can be traced back to whoever sold the gun to the individual. So why is that important? Because in Illinois, for example, if you go to a bar and you get drunk and you crash into somebody and they die, guess what? The bar is held responsible because they kept letting you drink. Unfortunately, in our country, gun shops and gun manufacturers are not held responsible for when people commit mass shootings because they didn't do background checks, because they didn't have a waiting period to hand over a military-style rifle to somebody, because they didn't do a thorough search on who they were giving a gun to. And so we have to start placing responsibility on some of these gun shops, these gun shows that happen. I think we need to tighten gun trafficking laws. And of course, I support universal background checks, the elimination of bump stocks and gun silencers, and also raising the federal age to purchasing a gun to 21.
Is there anything else that you want to make sure we talk about?
I think this is going to be an extremely interesting primary that's coming up nationally, right? We are going to see candidates from all across the country who we never thought would run for office really take the leap to do that. And I'm excited to see who those other candidates are, but also mostly in our district, I'm excited that we'll have options this time around, viable options, people who are bringing different grassroots perspectives to a lot of this policy. And I hope everybody goes to check me out. They can go to my website, kinaforcongress.com. And we're looking forward to expanding our volunteer list, folks donating to the campaign, and just being a part of this movement that we're building.
And everyone should remember that, of course, your important election is the primary, which is in the spring, not next November. So they should get involved soon.
Yes, please. It's March 17th, 2020. And so, we're really excited, and we have had a lot of excitement for the campaign. But as you said, we are moving swiftly and quickly. Illinois is one of those earlier voting states. So we definitely want to get people out to vote.
All right. Excellent. Well, Kina, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. This is one of a number of really exciting primary races around the Chicagoland area. So it's going to be the place to watch, I think, in March.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Wethlin and was created for use by this podcast.